Thank you, Ian, for coming to my podcast. I really appreciate it. And for people who don't know Ian at home, Ian is a guru when it comes to economics, banking, well, also teaching.
Yeah.
Your young ages when you,
Yes.
before Glebe turned into what it is today. So how many mortgages you did when you first started?
Well, thanks for having me on, Danny.
Yeah.
I really do appreciate this. I'm an unusual professor because I worked for 9 years in finance, AFCO finance, and then banking, lending gazillions of dollars in Ottawa and Eastern Ontario,
Yes.
but mostly Ottawa. And this was in the 70s and early 80s. I started in AFCO finance as a raw rookie high school dropout in 73. And I didn't even know that people didn't pay their bills, and they started to tell me you have to go on the credit collection desk and collect from people who are delinquent. I said, you mean people don't pay their bill? Like, I was so naive, it wasn't funny. But they trained the dickens out of me in all aspects of lending and collections,
Yes.
Interviewing and so forth. And then after 4.5 years there, I was a branch manager, and then I went to the Bank of Montreal, the main office branch on the Spark Street Mall,
yes.
which is now the Sir John A. Macdonald Reception Center for Parliament Hill because it got bought by the government.
Yes. Oldest bank in Canada.
Oldest bank in Canada. Though the 5 branches on the Spark Street Mall were very, very special to this day. I believe they are, but certainly they were then. They were very special because and I'm not being a snob here at all because I'm not, but all the really important people, and I don't mean me, I meant the customers, okay? Deputy ministers. I had 1/3 of Pierre Trudeau's cabinet on my books.
Yeah.
I had senators on my books. I had senior people from the Ottawa Hospital on my books. I had accountants who were partners in the big accounting. It was just the who's who of the Ottawa economic and business establishment, the top of the top of the top of the city. And that was all the 5 branches. I'm talking CIBC on the mall, RBC on the mall, Scotiabank. There were 5 banks on the mall. And we were dealing with la creme de la creme.
Yes.
And the bank trained the dickens out of me. That's where I learned how to read a balance sheet and read an income statement and so forth. And I was a loan officer there initially. Then I got promoted to loan manager. And then I got promoted to mortgage manager, which was the 4th largest branch of the Bank of Montreal in all of Canada for mortgages. I had a $250 million portfolio. This is in the mid-70s.
That's like all the mortgages in Ottawa at that
dollars in 1976 or 77. And then I got promoted to commercial credit officer, where I was lending a lot of money to small and medium-sized enterprises. 9 years, and I didn't work on the other side of the bank, with the admin side, deposit. All I did was lend and collect money, whether it was a loan or a car loan or a mortgage. At AVCO, I did second mortgages, which is much more risky.
Yes, of course.
I was doing
the riskiest ones.
I did I'm using slang English here. We did downstrokes. Downstroke was the slang term for lending the down payment to a young guy who was like 21 years old, who didn't have the down payment, and the bank needed a down payment to get it qualified to buy that vet.
Yeah.
And so we would do the really risky stuff, right?
Yes.
And so anyways, I did that, and it was fun because the Glebe was gentrifying people in the 70s. The Glebe had been built. It was the very first suburb of Ottawa. I keep telling people that, and they look at me like I'm crazy. The downtown of Ottawa started the market. That's where Ottawa started. It was in the market.
In the market.
The Glebe was started to be built in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. It was the first suburb of Ottawa. No kidding.
So it was like past the canal was a suburb. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. What happened, all that generation, they would buy the house, and in those days, I'm talking in the 1910s and 20s and 30s, long before my time, you didn't buy a house and renovate it. The word renovation didn't exist.
No.
You bought a house, you lived in it to the end of your life, you never changed a thing, except maybe a broken window, and that's it.
If a door fell off, you changed it.
That's it.
Yeah.
There was no such thing as renovation. So these houses were totally, literally, completely as they were when they were built 80 years ago. These young professionals were coming into me. This was in the 1970s. And when I say young professionals, I still remember some of them, They would come in, and the husband would be a medical doctor, just graduated from med school, and he had his medical diploma, and he was just starting at a big salary at the Ottawa Hospital for the Civic. And his wife was a PhD in economics and a very senior person in finance. These were double income, no kids, dinks, right?
Yeah.
Double income, no kids.
Yes.
And very high income, and they were young professionals, chartered accountants, dentists, professors, lawyers, all the professionals. And they would come in and they'd buy a house on the avenues, for example.
Yeah.
And they'd say, oh my God, we can't live in there. The kitchens haven't been renovated, and they have never been done.
The carpet's lighter green.
Oh, they're straight out of like 1900. You know what I mean? Plaster Paris, knob and tube wiring. No kidding. These houses, when I say they weren't renovated, I am not exaggerating. Most of them still had knob and tube wiring. They would have a 60 amp service in the basement. How do I know? Because we did home lookups in those days.
Yeah,
okay,
you showed up.
As a mortgage manager, I went to the house and walked around the house, and we were putting our money in. These young professionals would come to me and say, "Okay, we want to buy the house, and then we want you to bridge finance. So we've got architect's plans, and here they are, and here's the survey." It was all very documented. This wasn't fly seat of the pants. Banks are very conservative institutions, as I'm sure sure you
course,
know.
yes.
And in those days, they were even more conservative.
Yes,
okay?
yes. That if you do Purchase Plus, you gotta show all your receipts and
tax returns, letter of. I mean, we demanded all kinds of documentation.
Yes.
And then they come in and we say, okay, we used official appraisers, not real estate agents, real official appraisers with their degree in appraisal,
of course,
from the Appraisal Institute of Canada. And we'd say, okay, appraise the property as is right now, just as is, and then appraise it on expected value once the complete gut was done.
Yes.
And these young people were coming in, these young professionals in their early 30s. And when I say they were gutting the house, I'm not exaggerating.
Down to the studs.
They were taking it down to the studs on every floor.
Oh, wow.
Every floor. Because I would go and inspect sometimes because, you know, when you got a lot of money out there and the house hasn't been finished yet, there's a risk there.
Yeah, yes.
You know, if it isn't completed.
You don't want to take over half.
You don't want to take over half a completed house.
Yeah,
that's right.
Of course.
Gutted to the 2x4s. They would strip out every last one. They put in brand new wiring from top to bottom, strip out the old lead pipes. They'd replace everything. And it was really something. It was quite the experience, I'm telling you. I ended up financing, oh my God, I did dozens, probably several hundred for those years. In the mostly in the Glebe, some in the Golden Triangle, some in Old Ottawa South by Carleton University, even did the odd one in Rockcliffe. Didn't do Westboro in those days because Westboro, people don't realize this, but back in the 70s, Westboro was
still farm.
It was as bad as Vanier in those days.
Oh wow.
It was tough.
Yeah, it was tough.
Up and coming neighborhood in the 70s, okay?
They have cars still buried.
Sandy Hill was. Yep. Edinburgh. Oh, it was coming on strong.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the 70s.
So anyways, Vista was good.
Alta Vista was always good. Always good.
Yeah.
So I did that, and it was a wonderful experience, okay? And I to this day, I tell my students, I just went to convocation, I said to some of them, if you're a young person, 22, 23, 24, and you're not sure yet what you want to do in your life, I said, go work in a Canadian bank for 2 or 3 or 4 years, because they will train the dickens out of you.
Yep.
They have excellent benefits, and you'll get the big picture.
Yes.
Unlike any other employer, I believe the banks have the big picture. Yes. They are dealing with the totality of the economy, not just businesses. People don't realize that. Dealing with embassies, the banks are dealing with nonprofit. I had the Boy Scouts of Canada on my books when I was at Bank of Montreal. We had the Assembly of First Nations. It was called the Native Indian Brotherhood, but it's now the AFN for the Indigenous people. I had the ambassador of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. In other words, everybody has a bank account.
Of course.
Everybody.
Yes.
You see the totality of the world, of the economy, of the Canadian economy, working at a bank, and it's a wonderful experience.
I highly recommend it as well. So everyone I know is very successful in my industry. I can think of maybe 9 out of 10 of them have worked at a bank at some point.
I just think, let's say I don't ever want to have anything to do with finance or mortgages or lending. Okay, fine. But anybody who wants to learn, because an awful lot of Canadians don't have, and I don't say this critically, but they're mystified by banks. They see them as these mysterious, listen to the end, I'm not picking on him, but listen to the NDP leader. You know, when the things he says about banking, and you sit there and just scratch your head and say, oh my God, you don't have a clue. Yep. You don't have a clue. No, I'm not being unkind, just don't have a clue about how banks work.
Yep.
And
in high school, or
they should, because
they should.
Mortgages.
No, I didn't know what a mortgage was until after high school. I've done billions of dollars of mortgage.
You know that there's vaults down in the basement of every bank, and they've got huge buckets of money down there. There's no vaults. A bank is all borrowed money. And they look at you with these saucers.
They don't carry more like 5,000, 10,000. I think a day.
Banks have hardly any money at all. Yeah. They take it in and they lend it back out. That's how they make money. You know, lend, borrow low, and pay cheap, and lend high.
Mortgages are banks' lost leaders. They don't make much off.
Low.
Very low.
Okay, the cost is very low too, because there's very low delinquency.
Yes.
Low, you know, but the profitability is in credit cards. It's in unsecured loans.
Insurance.
You can lend a loan, a car loan, even today, 8, 9, 10%, 12% maybe. You can't get that on a mortgage. You know, but you want them to lock in, because once you got them on their mortgage, they're probably going to put all their business with you.
Product is the mortgage. That's what I was talking. That's the anchor
product.
With the mortgage, the anchor product is the mortgage. After that, you should be able to get them to open up a bank account. That's the second one. And then if you can get a credit card in there, you got that client forever.
Cross-selling.
Cross-selling. You get those.
Cross-selling.
And then there's always insurance, RSPs, TFSAs, mutual funds.
So it is interesting for people. They called me in one day and said, congratulations, Ian, you've been steadily promoted, which I had, and I was very happy. I was in my 20s, footloose and fancy-free. I wasn't married, no kids. Life was a beach. Yeah. And I was just having the time of my life.
Rock and roll on the weekends.
Oh, I was just rock and roll on the weekends, going to parties, meeting lots of girls. Yeah. Life was great. Yeah. Okay. Then they called me in and said, we have great news for you. You're being promoted. And I said, great, I love being promoted because I can make more money.
Yeah.
And they said, yes, you're going to First Canadian Place in downtown Toronto. Well, my face must have fallen to the floor.
Do that. Congratulations. Do this next for us.
And they said, the language was obviously very negative. And they said, what's wrong with that? And I just blurted it out. I was 28 at the time.
Yeah.
I said, well,
let
that's
them
a
know.
fate worse than death.
Let them know what year that was.
So that was, I can tell you exactly, it was 1981.
81.
81,
Being
yeah.
young kid being told to
Go to Toronto,
Go to
which
Toronto.
I never lived in. I had no desire to ever move to Toronto. Too big, too fast, too expensive. And I had all my friends here. My network was here. My expertise was here.
Yeah.
And the last place I wanted to go to was Toronto. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to Toronto.
Yeah.
And they were very good. They did not fire you, but they did say, okay, you're not going to get promoted anymore. So it just so happened I was doing my whole undergraduate degree part-time. I didn't go full-time ever before. I did it over 10 years, from 18 to 28, part-time going at night. I applied for a master's degree in public policy because I didn't want to do, first off, there was no MBA in Ottawa at the time. There was no MBA. And secondly, I know this is going to sound arrogant, but I didn't want to do an MBA because I felt that I knew more than any professor in a business school, because the dark and dirty secret of business schools is most professors have never worked in business.
Yeah.
So why would I want to go and listen to somebody who's never worked in business when I knew way more than they did?
Yeah, exactly.
But I'd learned at main office branch because I'd had all these senior people in finance, Department of Finance Canada, Parliament Hill, deputy ministers, trade ministers, and I realized I was an ignoramus about public policy and politics and government. A completely different animal.
Yeah.
I'm always dealing in economic issues,
Yes.
trade issues, capital gains.
experts.
I'm not dealing with social policy per se.
No.
I'm dealing with government deficits. I'm dealing with housing all the time.
Yes, big deal.
Because it's big and there's a huge amount of economics. I deal with interest rates all the time. Whereas
Yes.
I said, I got to do something about this. And so I decided to do a master's degree in public policy, of which I've never regretted. I focused on economic decision making, not, other stuff, social policy or terrorism or something. I just focused on economic, like
Yeah.
taxation,
Yes.
interest rates, that kind of stuff, right? And then I was doing very, very well, getting great grades. And a couple of professors said, well, why don't you apply for a PhD and we'll pay you a lot of money to be a student? Which just shocked me because I did not know. I was so naive. I didn't know that you could get, if you were a PhD student, they gave you money.
I didn't know
said,
that too.
You're going to pay me to sit there and read books and go to class. And they said, yes. So I did.
Yeah,
And
good
so,
move.
so I did, and that's a 4-year program. And before I'd even finished, the business school director at Carleton had heard over the grapevine about this strange guy. Strange because I was much older than all the other students. By this time, I started my PhD at 30. Well, most people start their PhD at 24, 25, and they have no experience whatsoever. Here was this older guy. They saw me as an old guy, right? Because I
Oh,
was
really?
30. Oh, yeah, that's old,
Okay,
for a
okay.
student.
Okay.
And he had all this banking experience, and in universities, universities are not very friendly, and they
Yeah.
see banks as pretty strange and hostile places,
Yeah.
right? Anyways, the word got back to him, and he found out about me, and he looked me up and said, let's go for lunch, and I went for lunch, and he said, I'd like to hire you to teach one course in the business school. Wow, it was
He
trial.
thought of it as like,
That's right.
I'm not going all in with this.
I'm going to try this
gonna
guy out.
Yeah,
Just
you
test him
got.
out. TAC, you're teaching evaluations. So he said, I want to bring you back next year and teach 5 courses full-time on a 1-year contract. I did, and I got very great, strong evaluations. And then he said, okay, I want to hire you on a tenure track basis, which is a permanent basis. I was hired. And then shortly after that, and I won't drag this story out, it's really important in terms of the larger story. I got hired on a tenure track in 1988. And then I started doing media, a lot of media interviews. And I started getting called to testify before the House of Commons Finance Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. And I started talking about housing because I'd been in a bank.
Yes.
By the way, I have testified before when they were expanding the outer boundary.
They went to like Rockland and then Stittsville.
I 2 or 3 times for the Rural Committee, the Economic Development Committee, and I was just stunned by all of these little NGOs there saying, bad, 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 developers are bad, they're greedy, they're selfish, and I thought, come on people, these guys have to build the houses. You aren't going to build the houses. All you do, I know this is very harsh, all you NGOs do is sit there and whine and complain, and you don't produce. You don't build houses. The developers have got, and so then they keep saying, well, governments have to do this. If you look at the history, and I have studied the history of housing in this country, principally since 1945 when C.D. Howe set up the Canada Mortgage and Housing is overwhelmingly produced and developed and built by the private sector.
Of course.
And this idea that we can have the governments build all the housing we need is so preposterously delusional. I'm not saying there shouldn't be affordable housing. I'm not saying that.
That's different.
I'm just saying it should be a small niche part of the total supply.
Yes.
But the idea that they're going to be the principal deliverer of housing for the middle class is just spurious. There isn't enough money. The reason we have a private sector is because it's distributed, and I mean by distributed, the individual developer says, okay, there's a market here on this street for a high-rise sized building that's going to have 20 units, and I can price out the cost per unit to build it. I know I can sell it to an individual Canadian for so much money, and I'll turn a profit on the deal. And that's what I mean by decentralized.
Yeah.
Whereas the governments don't have any understanding of scarcity. They have no understanding of pricing.
And the line. Like
And
that
it's-
person signing doesn't have
There's
any,
no skin in the game.
There's no skin in the game.
And if it's all theory,
Yeah.
there's no risk to you, the bureaucrat. If you screw it up and you make a really bad decision, oh, well, so what? The taxpayer pays
He's sleeping
for it.
well that night. Yeah, taxpayers.
I've been saying this on all my media interviews, radio, television, that we have made some very serious mistakes in Canada, I would say in the last 10 years or so, and this idea has emerged, and I drive the environmental groups, I'm sure, up the wall and out the door, and I'm not anti-environment,
No,
okay?
no.
But this idea has emerged.
I don't know how environment and building houses connect so much. I don't understand that.
I debated her name, and she's a very intelligent person, so I'm not trashing her. She's very intelligent. Jennifer Kizimat. She was the chief housing planner of the city of Toronto. She ran against John Tory for the mayor and lost. And she is a big advocate of this idea of urban sprawl, suburban sprawl. And I argue that this is a concoction
Yeah.
invented by environmentalists to prevent growth on the edges of the city. If you go, and I've been to almost every major city in Europe, and I've been to 44 or 50 U.S. states on road trips over my lifetime. You go to any major city, we all know where the cities grow. They grow on the edges.
Yep.
You go to London, and it started at the Tower of London. The City of London was the Tower of London in
Yeah.
downtown.
30 kilometers long.
miles out in
Yeah.
all directions. Because the cheapest land is always on the edges.
Yes.
And it always has been like that. I bought my very first garden home on the very, very outer edge of Ottawa in the Hunt Club at Paul Anka Drive. Why? Because it was the cheapest of the cheapest of the cheapest I could afford in 1974. Okay? We've been doing that for years. And yet this idea has emerged. We're going to build our housing through densification. I'm not opposed to densification, but we have been sold snake oil. We've been told that we can solve our housing crisis essentially only through densification. Because every time somebody says, let's build new suburban tracts, the critics go crazy. And they say, suburban sprawl, global warming, as if we're going to build all of our houses in the urban core. I want to throw a couple of stats at you that I did in this presentation.
Yes.
75% of all the immigrants to Canada, this is StatsCan data, go to 5 cities. 5. Not 500. Yes.
Toronto.
Yes.
Ottawa.
Yes.
Montreal.
Yes.
Calgary. I was going to say Calgary.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's it.
So it has these numbers between.
we have so much land.
So my point is, they're saying the following: we got to solve this housing problem. But they're really talking about building 3 to 5 million houses, because that's the estimated shortfall.
Yeah.
In 5 cities and in the urban core. I said, there isn't enough space in the urban core of those 5 cities for the next 5 years to build 3 to 5 million houses. I'm not opposed to densification and infill. Of course, it should be part of the mix, but we should also be building on the edges, because that's where the cheapest land is.
Yeah.
And my biggest criticism of the people I disagree with, who are progressives and liberals, is this: they keep saying we need more affordable housing, and they say we got to build it in the inner city. The most expensive land in any city is always in the urban core.
Of course.
The cheapest land is on the edges. And so this idea that affordable should be downtown or somewhere near the downtown, it's a complete contradiction. It shows their ignorance about the economics of real estate. Downtown is not affordable, has never been affordable. If you want to build affordable housing, you build it on the edges of the city in
Yes.
new suburban tracts.
Yes.
What you're building in the downtown, when I say the downtown, or the urban core, is very expensive housing. Nothing wrong with that. But this idea that we're going to solve the housing crisis for low-income people by building properties in the downtown is just factual nonsense.
Yeah, because if you drive 1 hour away, let's say, what's 1 hour away? Brockville, Cornwall, Kempville.
Yeah.
Yeah. The houses are half price.
Exactly. And guess what? People are moving there and jumping over the green belt, and they're moving out to these cities, Carleton Place.
Yeah, Carleton
and
Place, yeah.
Campbell,
Yep.
and so forth, because
Russell.
it is a Russell, because it is affordable. The conclusion, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
This is my theory,
Yeah.
my belief, okay?
Yeah.
Because I've talked to many, believe me, I've had many debates. I debated Jennifer Kizimat, okay? And and they deeply believe this idea of urban sprawl, people in the suburbs are very bad people because they drive their car
Right to downtown.
and the fuel to the downtown.
Oh, okay.
Danny, I've looked at the stats. First off, most people don't go into the downtown.
No,
It's a
look
myth.
home.
I'm not saying people don't go into the downtown. Most people in the suburbs work across the suburbs. They
Yeah.
live in one part of the suburbs and they go to a grocery store somewhere else in the suburbs, or they
Oh,
go
yeah.
to the doctor. In other words, they go across the suburb, and a handful go downtown. And post-pandemic, there's far, far fewer people going downtown
Yes.
than before. What I'm trying to say, number one, is that this myth that the people in the burbs are driving their cars all over the place and creating
Yes.
global warming is not supported empirically. That's the first point. The second point, and this is even more important, and this sounds kind of abstract, but it isn't. Global warming means that each of us consume stuff that's made with fossil fuels, oil and natural gas.
Yes.
So I get in an airplane, and guess what? I'm contributing to global warming because the plane uses fuel.
Of course,
Kerosene,
yeah.
jet fuel. Okay.
Yes.
Or a car uses gasoline. Okay.
Yes.
Your footprint, every last human being's footprint in Canada can be measured if I had the data. And I can use as a very good proxy your average income. The more money you make, the more money you spend. The more money you spend, the more stuff you buy.
Yes.
The more stuff you buy, the more energy was used to make the stuff that you buy.
Yes.
High income people have a much bigger footprint, global footprint, GHG footprint than low income people. They money.
They purchase more, to consume more.
And they consume, we go back to Stats Canada, and you look, and this is something that's fascinating. Believe me, in every Canadian city, and American, by the way, the urban core has the highest average incomes. Rosedale, Glebe, Rockcliffe, Town of Mount Royal in Montreal, Outremont, Point Grey. These are the urban core. They have incomes, average incomes, 2-3 times the burbs. So what's my point? The people in the downtown are far greater contributors to global warming than the people in the burbs.
That mathematically, yeah.
It's a straight arithmetic.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so this myth, this urban legend by my progressive friends that the people in the burbs who are causing the problem is false.
No.
It's false. It's the high income people like me, because I'm much higher income than people in the burbs,
Yep.
and I fly all over the place.
Yep.
Okay?
Yeah, you're flying everywhere.
Oh, I'm
you
flying all over the
yeah.
place. Believe me, I fly to Vegas to go and see you two.
Yeah.
And I just
Months ago?
I was there this fall. I'm going there to see the Eagles. We just went to Cleveland to see the Stones.
Yeah.
Because I've got the income. I can go and do all these things and
Consume
fly
more.
here. I consume more. And when you can, I'm not saying this is bad. I'm not trying to say that I'm a bad person or that the people in the urban core are bad. That's not my point. My point is they've been selling us snake oil. We can't build houses on the edges of the city because those people out there are causing the problem of global warming. And what I'm saying is, no, individually they're not. Yes, there's more people in the edges. 80% of Canadians live in the suburbs, okay?
Oh, it's 80%.
80%, okay.
Okay.
But if you are talking, and we should be talking per person, emissions per person.
That's right.
The emissions per person in the urban core is much higher than anywhere else because they got way more money
Probably 3
to
times.
spend
Yeah.
and consume, and that consumption of cars,
Boats
trips
and
boats
cottages
and RVs
and- yeah,
cottages
yeah.
takes more money.
Yeah.
So the urban footprint of someone in the Glebe is much higher than the urban footprint of somebody
Bigger cars.
in Stittsville.
Yep.
And so what I argue is that it's false that we shouldn't be growing on the edges of the city. And finally, that argument, oh my God, the farmers, if we do that, we won't have any food to eat because they're producing our food. I have the stats from Agriculture Canada. And those farms around the edges of Ottawa and Toronto, those are what I call hobby farms.
Some
you
strawberries,
take your kids
yeah.
there. This is what a farm looks like. Okay?
Yeah.
Like it's a lot of fun.
The guys
I
wearing
did it.
overalls.
I've taken my
Yeah.
grandchildren.
Yeah.
It's fun. I've got the stats, and 95% of our food supply is coming from these mega, gigantic agricultural corporations in Western Canada. The idea, and I've actually had arguments with people on this. Oh my God! If we go and build houses on the edges of the city, we're not going to have enough food to eat. First off,
Corn.
we import 1/3 of all of our food.
It comes from Mexico or
Mexico, California,
Peru, yeah,
Central
California,
America.
yeah.
Why? Because you can't grow blueberries in a snowbank in January. You can't, okay?
You can't?
No.
No,
Or,
okay.
or cucumbers.
Or cucumbers.
Or tomatoes.
Or any-
Okay, or anything. First off, we import 1/3 of all our bloody food, and that's straight out of StatsCan data. Then the remaining food, it's not growing on those little tiny hobby farms. They're very tiny, they're wonderful, they're family farms,
Yes.
that's good, let's get romantic.
Yep.
Okay, I grew up on a family farm too,
Yes,
by the way, in
yes.
Eastern Ontario, and they
Potatoes were you growing? No, what was it?
roosters, we had pork,
Yeah.
and we had beef.
There you go.
Seriously. But my point is, if you look at the ag stats, and
Yeah.
by the way, the ag stats are excellent in this country, from
Yes.
Stats Canada and Ag Canada. A huge amount of food production in this country is these mega agricultural corporations.
Alberta?
In Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba.
Yes.
Okay.
That's where land's created in Canada.
And so this idea that if we go and build new suburbs on the edges of Ottawa or Toronto, we're not going to be able to eat anymore is just fantasy.
Yeah,
It's factually
Yes.
false. It's nonsense, people. It is people blowing smoke and bloviating who have never looked at the data.
This is what they're thinking is they drove by and they saw a farm and they think that's where all of our food for the
Exactly.
city comes from.
And they're wrong.
That's farm. That's 30 minutes away.
These are what I call hobby farms.
Yeah.
And by the way, they're great.
Yeah, they're fun. We like them. Yeah, we want them.
And there are a lot of people like to take their kids out, their grandchildren out, like I do. And you can pick tomatoes or pick raspberries,
strawberries. Yeah.
Strawberries.
Yeah.
I mean, we take them out every year down to Dents, down on the by Prescott and Cardinal.
Yep.
And you can take them in there, and you go out and you pick strawberries and
Flip
it's a
your
lot of fun.
basket.
You pick a basket and
You pay for the basket, not the way. It's fun. Yeah.
and you pick apples and all that stuff. It's fun.
Yeah.
But that is not the producer of our food supply.
No, there's no way.
Okay, it's there. It's tourism. It's I call it agricultural tourism. It's what it is.
Well, yeah, it's only there for what, 2 weeks? Is there? You can eat the fruit there? A
And
month?
it's not to put it down. I'm not knocking these people. Let's not spin this false nonsense. This is the source of food in Canada. It is not. It is simply not.
No.
That's the third argument why we, quote, can't build houses on the edges, I hear, and they're wrong.
Yeah.
The solution where I'm going,
Give us the
is
solution.
to do densification and infill. No question about it.
Yes.
But it is not going to be the solution in aggregate for our housing crisis. We've got to face reality and build a lot more new suburban tracts on the edges of cities, as we have done for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
Go to Paris, go to London, go to Glasgow, go to Moscow, go to Kiev, go to Warsaw, go to any American city, go to Toronto. It used to be right downtown, and now it's
Rome.
way out.
Yeah,
go to Rome.
Yep.
So my point is, for 2,000 years, that's how we have grown. And we've got to acknowledge that and stop making policy based on false ideology, based on false information about the economy, the importance of the agricultural land, and so forth, or the fact that they claim it's contributing to global warming, when I argue the people most contributing most heavily are the high-income people in the urban core
'Cause they can
of the
afford
Glebe or Rockcliffe or Westboro or Sandy Hill or Golden Triangle, because their incomes are literally 3 times higher than the average incomes in the suburbs.
Every large
Every big
city.
city.
Every large city.
This isn't something unique to Ottawa. Rosedale, downtown Toronto, or the beaches.
Yes.
Oh my God. Or Town of Mount Royal or Outremont in Montreal.
Yeah.
Or Point Grey in
Yes.
Vancouver. You go to the urban center, and I don't mean literally the downtown, I mean the urban core.
Yes.
And I include Alta Vista as part of the urban
Yes.
core.
Yes.
Old Ottawa South as part of the urban core.
Yes.
The average incomes there are very, very high.
Yes.
And so they consume a lot more, and therefore they contribute a lot more to global warming and emissions, even though they won't acknowledge it or admit it.
People you're talking about do live in the downtown core, and they're the bigger consumers as well.
Opposed to building new housing tracts on the edges of the city. So again, I'm not.
To do, I said, you build out there, the land is almost free because
It's very, very cheap.
it's very, very cheap.
And immigrants who are just starting out to get their foot in the market. That's how
Yeah.
I got my foot in the market way back when I was 23 years old.
Their own, like, let's say you went to the East End, they have their own mall,
Yes.
they have their own theater,
Yes.
they have their own restaurants,
ecosystem.
Everything.
Absolutely. Phil, and I mean, they got everything. They got Home Depots and
Yeah.
Canadian Tires and Loblaws.
Yeah, they have everything.
They've got everything. And this idea
it's not
that
like
they're
you
all
let them
driving
come-
into the downtown,
No.
another urban legend by environmentalists. Most people in the burbs don't ever go near the downtown because they don't have to. They have their full community out there.
Yes.
And so the idea they're all driving into the downtown every day is simply not true. In fact, right now we have ghost towns in the downtown because of remote work.
Oh, I know people who had to, like, they lost their business that were on Slater because the upstairs
businesses collapsed.
Yeah, the upstairs was their, like, they would service and
Right.
give haircuts to the
That's right.
upstairs, and
Yeah.
and now there is no
Yeah.
buddy up there, but he's still paying 20 grand a month. It's like, hey,
Yeah.
you want me to pay you 20 grand, but
Yeah.
I signed here knowing there's 5,000 people in this
Yeah.
building that come in every day. Now there's zero. Even I think the Tim Hortons on Slater closed at one
Yeah,
point.
yeah. I'm not against. We're going to talk now very quickly about the downtown to the extent that we can repurpose these buildings. And I'm not
Yes.
just talking Ottawa, but yes, we're here in Ottawa.
Yes.
But this is going on because believe me, I'm studying this. New York City, this is a big problem in New York City. The buildings are collapsing in value. These big office buildings.
Oh yeah,
It's
90%
going on in
off.
Chicago. It's going on in San Francisco. To the extent that smart developers like you or others can buy those buildings and renovate them, repurpose them, and turn them into condos or apartments, great. Good for them. I'm skeptical. I've actually listened to some architects in New York City and developers who say, yes, it can be done, but maybe only about a third of the buildings. Because the older buildings are so expensive to retrofit that it's cheaper to tear them down.
Yes.
But so, okay, 1/3 of the buildings. If 1/3 of these buildings that have become abandoned in downtown Ottawa can be repurposed into apartment buildings, fantastic. And then the ones that aren't economic, you tear them down, the land is still there,
Yep.
it's still valuable, and you can put up condos for higher income people. But the idea, it's going to be the the source of the solution for affordable housing for low-income people or modest-income people is snake oil.
One on Rideau Street, where the BMO is, in the right at the corner, King Edward and Rideau.
Yeah, yeah.
One got repurposed. It was an old building, no one
Yeah.
used, and they got repurposed. Students are, it's mostly like a student rental
Yeah.
environment, and it got filled up in a week because university housing is bleeding for. They're so desperate for people because I
agree.
think a student pays on average like $1,000 a bedroom.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I've heard from my university.
Yeah.
And of course, every decent-sized city has colleges and universities. Ottawa has 100,000 students that come in here every year. Now that's Ottawa.
10% of our city.
Yes. Now that's not just my university. That's Ottawa U. It's Carleton. It's Algonquin. It's Cité Collège. Like there's probably 5 or 6 in total, but in aggregate, it's a big number. I'm not saying that there isn't a role for government to build affordable housing, which is just the code word for subsidized housing.
Yeah.
But the argument that we are going to address the housing crisis mostly through subsidized housing or government-funded housing is nonsense because the governments don't have enough money. They have a crisis on their hands. We all know that.
Yes.
And the crisis, ironically, is not housing. Yes, we have a crisis of housing. The big number of crises for governments, and we know what it is, it's called healthcare. Because people like me are approaching 25% of the population. And when you turn 65 and go and above, we consume vastly greater amounts per person of healthcare. I've got the stats from Health Canada and CIHI, Canadian Institute of Health Information. When you turn 65, your consumption of healthcare goes to the roof.
Yeah, your visits are more,
You go to more specialists, and each year that goes by, the amount you consume per person on average goes up, up, up. Governments are directly responsible for healthcare because we have public healthcare.
Yes.
Governments are not responsible for housing directly in the sense they're not responsible to build all the houses in Canada. But this myth has been emerging that government is going to be the solution. Instead of saying, no, the private sector has to be the solution to build most of the housing shortages in this country.
the entrepreneur to start developing because of the red tape.
Because of the red tape and barriers.
It takes so long to build anything.
I know, I've got the stats.
It costs so much to start. And while you're at it, you're being treated like a second-class citizen. All you're asking is to develop the property.
Yeah.
Then you got the neighborhoods, especially the older neighborhoods.
Yes.
They will pick it outside your house to stop you from digging.
I know.
And then
I believe this, Danny. I really do. One of the advantages of going to the edges of the city, first off, the land is a lot cheaper.
Yes.
I didn't say there's zero red tape. There's less red tape.
Less.
You don't have NIMBY because there's nobody there. It's raw land.
Yes.
Whereas you go into an established neighborhood and it is difficult. And this has been documented up the wazoo. You go into an existing neighborhood and guess what? The existing people that live there say, don't build in my backyard, which I understand.
I get it. I
live in the Glebe. I do not want someone to put a big, tall, high-rise in my backyard or right behind my backyard. Okay? But you go to the edges of the city where the land is far cheaper, the restrictions are far less, and it's going to be much more doable.
You're bothering nobody out
And
there.
you're not bothering. And so I'm not saying don't do densification. I'm just saying that anyone who thinks that that's going to solve our housing crisis is not looking at the evidence.
No,
So we've got to look. I think most of our housing shortage is going to have to be built on the edges.
'Cause I was told-
And then a small percentage will be done through infill and existing areas of the city.
A good country like Canada had these 3 pillars. One was always a really good education system.
Yep.
And second is healthcare system.
Yes.
And third is a justice system. That's what their main focuses should always be on.
I agree.
I don't know why. Depends which side the person's voting. He'll say if it's safe or not safe. But all I turn on the news and there's car robberies everywhere and extortion in like Montreal for businesses and whatever. You turn on that. You're just okay. It's car robberies. Is this just news selling or is this really happening?
Remember, the problem is only in the biggest cities in Canada. If you look at the average housing prices outside of those 5 or 6 or 7 cities, we don't have a housing crisis.
No.
You can go and buy a house in Prescott, Ontario, 1 hour from here for $225,000.
Yeah.
You can go out to Smiths Falls, to Kemptville, and buy a beautiful house on a lovely lot for $500,000.
Yep.
So, yes, we have a housing crisis, but it's in the big cities, and then you can say, well, no, you don't understand, it's because it's a big city. I've got data for the average permitting from scratch to completion for American cities, hear me out. The American cities, big cities, are skating circles around Canadian big cities. So they can't say, oh, well, you don't understand, it's the problems of Toronto and Vancouver. Vancouver. There's big cities in the States that are just as big, and they are developing, permitting, and giving permits to developers much, much faster. And the average housing prices in the States, in most cities, not all, but in many cities, is much, much lower. My sister is an American citizen in Tucson. You can buy a lovely house in Tucson for $350,000, a private single-family home.
Double garage.
Double garage, $350,000. Okay, that's US dollars. Still, it is so much cheaper than Ottawa. And Ottawa is
built in
cheaper
half
than
a year.
Toronto. So my point is, I don't buy their argument, oh, it's just because of the way things are. No, it's because of the deliberate policies that people have developed in the big cities, the 5 or 6 or 7, that are deliberately slowing down development and putting barriers in front of developers to build affordable housing. I see them as the problem.
Yes. As a business, let's say I ran the city of Ottawa and I had to run it like a business. The only profit, so the city of Ottawa does not profit except one thing. The only thing the city of Ottawa profits off of is your property taxes.
Yeah.
Everything else is break even. They have like a break even
No, I
system.
understand.
So wouldn't you, as a business, want to push as much development as possible so it brings more property taxes to your city?
Danny, I really deeply believe this, okay? And I'm not paid to say this by anybody. Anyone who says, Ian Lee's just speaking what the developers say. I don't consult to anybody. All I get is paid for by Carleton. My salary comes from Carleton, and they sure as hell don't tell me what to think, or say, or read, or at all.
Research, do, or anything.
Okay, I do. Okay. My point is, I've come to the conclusion in these 5 or 6 or 7 big cities, it's ideology that's the problem. They have developed this idea, the suburbs are the problem, the suburbs are responsible for global warming, densification is going to solve our problems, government has to build most of the housing. This is an ensemble, a package of values that I believe is fundamentally wrong. Wrong. Did you know you can buy a house, the average house price in Winnipeg, Manitoba is $330,000? $330,000!
That's great.
You can't buy an outhouse in Ottawa for $330,000.
Maybe in the 80s.
So my point is, it's not a Canadian problem. It's a 6 or 7 big cities that has that problem. You go into the Maritimes, most of the cities in the Maritimes, the house prices are very, very reasonable. You go into Eastern Ontario, they're very reasonable. Northern Ontario, Thunder Bay, very reasonable. It's just 5 or 6 or 7 cities with very, very philosophically anti-development, anti-growth mentality, philosophy. I'm not trying to say that they're bad people or that they don't have freedom of speech or freedom to think whatever they want. They can think whatever they want. Good for them. I'm saying they should not be allowed to create these policies that are causing such suffering for so many people. That's my argument. It's deliberate.
To hurry up and wait.
It's deliberate.
Yeah, it is.
I believe it's deliberate.
Yeah.
And I've got the data from CMHC showing the average permitting in these big cities is far, far longer because they're putting up many, many more barriers and regulations and restrictions on developers to develop. And these are not in the cities of Arnprior. And they say, well, you can't compare a big city to a small city. The American cities, you take an American
Huge
city
cities
that are large and compared to Canadian large cities, they permit much faster the development process. So they can't use that argument, well, that's because we're big and Arnprior is small. So there's some large American cities, especially in these, for example, in Texas and Arizona, in the American South, not so much in the Northeast. Boston, New York, they have a very similar problem to the Torontos. And
yes.
But there's a good many parts of the United States where they have very much more rapid permitting and development process. They cannot use the argument, we're special, we're unique, and there's no solution. It is, they are causing our problems. So there we go.
That's a few.
And they are.
I think we're one of the, Canada has probably one of the highest in the world for development fees per capita.
Yeah.
I don't know why, because...
I'd have to look into it yet. I'm going to be doing research on that to find out why the development fee.
They just went up. They just keep going up all the time.
I know.
By very high percentages. 11% was like the last one. The new one's 6 or 7%.
Yeah.
Nobody can figure it out. And then what's funny is when you hear the local boards, if you see any forums or Facebook, they say, oh, the park. So we wanted to fix the parks. And there's always a reply of, there's no money in the park. And the park in Luffy, we collect money. There is no money in them. Like, I know like 10 guys who built around here and they paid $400,000. You can't put a new slide with $400,000. This money is for parks. So where's this money? I guess it must be an IOU or it must have been, it doesn't make sense, right?
Because I want to see what and do a comparison between the American cities. And find out what the issue is there on the developer fees.
Yes. So tell us about your plugs, where to find you, where
I'm on Rob Snow. He has a program across Canada on Rogers Radio. It's called Everything You Need to Know with Rob Snow. It also streams on the website of Rogers Radio. So that's Rob Snow. Every Tuesday from 1:30 to 2 o'clock. Every Tuesday from 3:20 to 3:45, I'm on Niagara Falls Radio, CKTB, I believe, with John. I'm on with him. On Wednesdays, I'm on Sirius National Radio, Canada Talks with Matt Gurney.
Yes.
Very well known. He's on the National Post. And I'm on with him from 11:40 till 12 noon on every Wednesday. Every Thursday morning, I'm on Sirius National Radio, Canada Talks with Arlene Bynan at 8:40 until 9 a.m. every Thursday. And then I'm on weekly on Hamilton CHML, usually in the afternoon with Scott on the afternoon show. We're talking about taxation, capital gains. We're talking about all these economic stuff.
The new stuff.
Yeah, the good stuff.
Yeah.
And then I'm on about once a month on Todd Venot on Halifax Radio, which goes out to the entire Maritimes. And then roughly every month I'm on a thing called CBC Radio Syndication. And the radio syndication is in Toronto and CBC head office. And these are people that help all the radio stations of the CBC across Canada. So they'll take a story that's emerging in the news and then they'll find one expert to talk to and then they debrief.
Yes.
So it's me, say, or somebody, it could be somebody else.
I want to say thank you for coming. I feel like we could have went on for another couple of hours. And would you come back?
Sure, a lot of fun.
A lot of
It's always
fun.
fun to talk about real estate.
Thank you so much, Ian.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
very
coming
much.
on. I
Thank
appreciate